Good afternoon, and welcome once again to the Rhinebeck Reformed Church and to our journey of discovery and learning together. As always, we are delighted to be in your presence, and we're delighted to have our conversations facilitated through Dr. Bruce Chilton, who is one of the preeminent New Testament scholars in the world. As we all know, he is affiliated with the Bard College. He has had a plethora of notable books and scholarly works which continue to influence not only the academy, but also spiritual leaders, including pastors. Our topic today is Liberation Theology, and he will be discussing the practical components of Liberation Theology. We welcome members of the Rhinebeck Reformed Church, as well as other fellow learners, including those who are part of the Institute of Advanced Theology at the Bard College. Without further ado, Dr. Bruce Chilton will lead us in our conversation and discussion.
It is always a pleasure to join you and also to be in the company of Pastor Luis Perez. As he has explained, we are now coming to a culmination of a series on liberation theology. The phrase itself comes to us from South America and Central America from the period after the Second Vatican Council. At that time, liberation became a major movement within theology, contributing to efforts of national and class revolution in several parts of the world. As I explained in our very first session, liberation theology had a very bumpy ride towards the end of the 20th century, and now is seeing something of a resurgence during the 21st century. The perspective we have taken, however, has looked to the period even before liberation theology took its name. And in the last presentation that we had, there was a conversation between myself and the director of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Presidential Library about the way in which Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been influenced by a movement called the social gospel, which was the predecessor of liberation theology. The orientation that Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought to bear was that there were certain values that came out of what he called the Judeo-Christian tradition that insisted upon the importance of freedom. And he was so deeply influenced by the social gospel movement that he deliberately brought to expression conceptions of freedom that were embedded in the social gospel, and that he then brought into the field of the way in which this nation should prepare for the Second World War. On January the 6th, 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave his State of the Union message to Congress. In that message, he targeted what he called the 4 freedoms. And that part of his speech was so striking that it became known as the 4 Freedoms Address, rather than as the State of the Union message. And I would like to concentrate on those 4 freedoms as we begin, because what I am doing, since this is the culmination of our series on liberation theology, is working back through the results of what we found in our previous sessions in order to concentrate on the issue of today's discussion, which is practical liberation. What does one do actually to enact the liberation we're referring to? And so we turn to these freedoms that liberate, and the reason that Franklin Delano Roosevelt specified them was that they were explicitly in his understanding bipartisan. That is, he insisted that the presidential election which was passed had not represented any dispute about the necessity of maintaining these freedoms in opposition to the rise of tyranny which was being conducted by Adolf Hitler. The only issue was, what was the appropriate response, which is just what he targeted during his address as a whole. And as he came to the end of the speech, he referred to the four freedoms as what unified the country. In that sense, the address was without question political. That is, it targeted the issue of the American community as a whole. The term politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means city, thinking of the city as being the society at large. For FDR, the four freedoms were, in fact, societal values that bind us together and that are rooted in the Judaic-Christian tradition. There are matters of common morality. And for that reason, they extend well beyond issues of partisanship. At a time of national emergency, no conscientious politician could put the interest of party first. They must take second place to the concern for the nation as a whole. This particular address came to my mind on January 6th of this year, 2021, because on that occasion, as we all know, the session of Congress, which had met in order to confirm the results of individual states in sending their electors to elect the next president, were to be confirmed. And that session was violently interrupted. The question of who was responsible and to what degree is one that is going to occupy our court systems and other kinds of deliberation for some time to come. But we could know on the day itself, on January the 6th, 2021, that this was, in a very distressing sense, a unique event in American history, where our democratic processes had been ground to a halt for a period of time by the deliberate use of intimidation. What happened was a direct contradiction of the four freedoms that were set out precisely 80 years before, on January the 6th, 1941. When the president on that occasion set out the values that the United States was using to confront what it could see very clearly was a form of political evil, whatever your party affiliation might be. And so he set out as paramount, first of all, the freedom of speech and expression. Now, in our time, I think it's very clear that these values, which once we talked about exporting to the rest of the world, need some very careful attention right at home. Because efforts are made in a variety of ways to deny freedom of expression and speech. This comes not only by means of attempts to silence people, which do occur, but also with the insistence of particular groups of people that everyone should say the same thing, that if they do not accept a particular ideological line, then they should not bring to expression what their ideas are. That first freedom is one that could use restoration. And this, to my mind, is an issue not simply of politics on a national scale, but also of culture. So I would like to turn, when we come to the end of this presentation, to issues of how practically one can lift the freedom of expression. Side by side with that, there is also the freedom, the second freedom, namely of belief and faith. And belief and faith are obviously related to one another, but they're also distinct in their meanings. I can believe something without actually acting on that belief. But when I say I have faith in something, that implies that I put my reliance on it to such a degree that I act accordingly. That is what religion is. Religion is not simply a matter of declaring oneself to be a certain kind of believer. Rather, when one engages the object of belief and begins to act out that particular value, like the four freedoms themselves, then we're talking about an act of faith. And it's clear that in a democratic society, it is vital for people to be able to act upon their particular beliefs, to show forth their faith by means of what they actually do. That is one of the ways in which we avoid conformism, in which people simply do what they're told instead of engaging on the basis of conscience. Freedom of worship, in that sense, is vital within a democracy. And that includes the freedom to be able to state openly that one does worship without that being taken as being some kind of disqualification for public discourse. You know, the Constitution does say that Congress shall make no law in respect of an establishment of religion. It does not say that religion has no part in the way in which we consider the values that animate us. Part of the distress of our culture at this time, in my opinion, is that there are shortcut interpretations available of the Constitution, of law, often of the Bible, that push people into stances which are in fact not in the Constitution, not in the law, not in the Bible. Part of freedom of expression is the willingness to listen. Part of the freedom of faith is the willingness to observe and to appreciate how others engage in worship. And then, having set out the first two principles, freedom of expression, freedom of faith, President Roosevelt went on to speak of two freedoms from. And the first was the freedom from want and deprivation, because he observed that what had brought about the Nazi tyranny in Europe had been the experience of deprivation and the feeling of deprivation. The sense that one had not been treated fairly. And he appreciated that even as the free nations of the world should arm themselves in order to defend against what he already saw as an inevitable attack, they had to consider one of the sources which makes tyranny attractive to people, namely a feeling of want that gives the impression that only someone who overrides freedom itself would be able to put the situation right. In our time, as we know very well, deprivation is not on the decrease. Deprivation has been increasing during the period of the pandemic. And what it has brought to light as well is that deprivation was increasing prior to the pandemic. Namely, that poverty was increasing. This comes out especially in the rate at which it has been shown that children are malnourished. Malnourished children are an indication that a society, a culture, has failed in its basic commitment to these four freedoms. Clearly, a situation that needs to be reversed. How it should be reversed is a matter for democratic discussion. That it has to be reversed is a matter of moral certainty. And then finally, FDR also specified the fourth freedom, the freedom from intimidation and fear. He knew very well that tyrannies work by threatening to take away what a person has. And these threats work even better when one has very little. Under those circumstances, a society can get to the point where it feels dependent on a strong leader, not democratically elected, who rules by means of threat instead of by means of consent. Fear and intimidation also work in our environment. There are many people, for example, who have only had access to medical care because of their employment. Now they're unemployed. How does one go about addressing that situation? To what extent are people right now required to accept working conditions which under other circumstances they would never accede to, except that they don't appear to have the choice? We are living also in a situation in which the means to combat the pandemic are becoming available, especially in the case of vaccines, but they are not being distributed equitably. Even after the health crisis is brought under control, the economic crisis is going to last probably for several years. There will be fear and anxiety that demand attention. So the peculiar situation we're in is that the four freedoms that FDR talked about 80 years ago as being what we have to bring to the rest of the world, today we have to think about how we restore at home. And when you look at the range of the problems, I quite understand that many people wonder, do we have the resources within ourselves to cope with these problems? That's why also the study of liberation theology is helpful, because it specifies not only what needs to be done, that I think we can understand, but also it sets out the powers that liberate, that is, the forces within ourselves by which we can develop the character necessary to address our situation. Because finally, the confrontation is a matter of character more than a matter of program. It's a matter of knowing what cannot be accepted in our common life, and on that basis, putting that unacceptable circumstance straight. And so in previous sessions, we have spoken of these powers that liberate. And again, moving back in reverse chronological order, we looked upon the way in which the New Testament speaks about the message of Jesus' resurrection. And today I would just like to target one statement made by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. Just as we bore the image of the person of dust, that is Adam, who was made from dust, we shall also bear the image of the person of heaven, that is Christ. Now, we had an entire discussion of the resurrection, obviously. The topic is one that could easily absorb us again for an entire session. But I just want to focus on this truth of what Paul says, which is also applicable to all the statements about Jesus' resurrection in the New Testament, and for that matter, in the creeds. Because it highlights a basic misunderstanding about the resurrection, not only outside the church, but sadly, all too often, inside the church. And that misunderstanding is often the resurrection is seen as if it were only a part of the story of Jesus. That's not the message. The message, of course, is that Jesus triumphed over death, and also that he shows the way in which humanity is made to be eternal too. The triumphant news of the resurrection is not only that Jesus overcame those who killed him unjustly, but also that his cause of justice is one to which every single human being belongs because one is a human being. That we are not limited by the material constraints that confront us. We might feel that way, and that feeling of being completely constrained, being completely at the mercy of another, that's called despair. And despair is something which many of us may well feel right now, and I understand it. But the message of the resurrection is you are not determined by those conditions. Your identity is greater than that particular kind of material constraint. We are made for something better and can become more and more what we have been made for. The resurrection is a powerful force because it's not just about Jesus. It's also about us. And in a similar way, we also talked about another major principle in liberation theology, and indeed in theology long before that, namely that of the Exodus. It is the memory of redemption and what the memory of redemption does. And so I've chosen, again, out of a rich literature, just one statement from the book of Deuteronomy. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Just as you can look at the resurrection in a very limited way, so you can look at the Exodus in a limited way. You can look at the Exodus as simply being, oh good, we're out of Egypt. It's a festival of getting out, and therefore now being free. And it is that, just as the resurrection is about Jesus. But listen to what we are told in this section of Deuteronomy. Not, remember I got you out of there. Remember you were a slave. Remember you had the requirement of being redeemed out of constraint in order to be who you are right now. And this awareness led to the prophetic insistence that we reviewed in some detail early on in our series, the insistence that because you were once a slave, you have obligations to those who are presently enslaved. This led to Israelite tradition taking a very different view of slavery from most civilizations in history, and ultimately became a principle in the abolition of slavery, guided by principles of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Because as in the case of the Exodus, so in the case of Jesus' resurrection, the understanding is very clear that what applies to us also applies to others. If God has freed me by means of the Exodus, God calls on me to free others on the basis of the same redemption. If Christ has been raised from the dead to provide me with newness of life, then that applies to every other person whom I meet. Those innocent little words in the book of Leviticus, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," are profoundly important, which is why Jesus actually cited them, to insist that what is true of one is true of another. So our awareness of the principle of Exodus and our awareness of the principle of resurrection represent forces within our lives that we can deploy in order to confront what we must within our current situation. And we can also learn from others how we should go about that deployment. Here I might say, in addition, that we could continue our investigation, if we wish to look at the way in which there are powers that liberate in other religious traditions, in Islam, in Buddhism, in Hinduism. Right across the global religions, there is, in fact, an understanding that humanity was not made simply for itself, so that every single person is not simply a set of personal interests. Every single person is something else and bears a relationship to every other person. On some occasion, we might look at the way in which other traditions work these ideas out and how they are related to the Judeo-Christian tradition. But right now, given our circumstance, I've particularly looked at Judaism and Christianity because they have fed in, historically, to the development of liberation theology, and also to the last topic I'd like to consider, namely, how these powers that liberate, related as they are to the four freedoms, also amount to what I call means that liberate. That is, practical ways in which a person can make liberation happen. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was speaking about the international scene and the national scene. They are very important. As I said earlier on, that is part of politics in the best sense. It doesn't have to be partisan, but it does have to be engaged in the major institutions of government here and in other countries as well. But we don't all have to do politics. This is probably the happiest thought I wake up with on some mornings. We don't all have to do politics, because the task of liberation is not only a political task. In fact, the task of liberation is not most importantly a political task. Most importantly, liberation is a cultural task, namely the way in which we live every day, which is indeed something that includes politics, but it's bigger than politics. Franklin Delano Roosevelt could never have made the Four Freedoms Address without the influence of a culture that insisted upon the value of others, a culture that produced him, as I was saying in the very last session, out of his education at Groton and then at Harvard. The basic values of the social gospel were there as they were transmitted to him by his family here in the Hudson Valley. That culture is what he brought to political expression, not the reverse. Liberation starts with what people do as people. If that happens to include politicians, it's fine, but actually not determinative of the result. What's determinative of the result is the fact that this is done. And what I'd like to suggest in closing is that these means that liberate are brought to bear precisely when we put the particular freedoms into practice. So the first, freedom of speech and expression, is brought into reality. It becomes an experience as well as an idea when we engage with others with respect. There's been a great deal of comment recently, and I think it's justifiable comment, that there's been a certain loss of civility in politics. This, I think, is perhaps one of the great understatements of all time. Yes, indeed, there's been a loss of civility. But the issue here is not simply that we have to clean up our language, which we should anyway, but it's not just being polite. It's having respect for one another. It's knowing the other person who does disagree. Look, we disagree with everyone. There'll be some matter or another on which we don't agree, in which our judgments differ. Our tastes go their different ways. And that, indeed, is part of the enjoyment of interacting with other people. The very fact that they're not simply the same as us. But when we engage with the understanding that that person has a particular opinion for a reason, it means that I am encouraged, yes, to come to expression, to speak myself, but also to listen, to hear. I'm very struck that people sometimes get themselves stuck in certain modes. They talk, and they talk some more, and they further explain their own position, and they don't listen. Or they listen and listen and listen, I guess, but then don't say anything in response until I get to the point where I think, are they in fact listening? Have they tuned out? Speech and expression are free when they're engaged, when there is a genuine back and forth with another person or other people. It's a kind of art. It's not necessarily something we should assume we can do very well. We probably have to work at it. That's one of the hidden principles of the Four Freedoms. They all involve a discipline. They're not only a freedom from constraint, they're also actions with a purpose. And that also involves the second freedom, the freedom of belief and faith. How is that put into practice? That's put into practice by a dedication to core values. That is, as I alluded to at the beginning, it's more than saying, I believe. It is saying, I put my trust in what I believe to be true, and therefore I act on that basis. That is exactly what worship is in the proper sense, and why it is extremely important for those of religious faith to go beyond the statement that they believe, to go beyond the identification with a given kind of church or synagogue, and actually show up with the community, to join with that community. Sometimes these days it has to be a virtual community. That's the nature of the passage we're going through. But it's a community nonetheless, because that community enables us, through dialogue, through that engagement, to know what exactly our core values are and to put them into action. The action that comes out of worship is a vital aspect of that second freedom. And that's also, it is why it is vitally important within our society in particular, that those who act on the basis of religious motivation should not only be tolerated, they should be encouraged. Because they are bringing into our common life exactly the values which will help to enrich us all. We don't have to agree with the motivation of every person who does good, but we should have the ability to value everyone who does good, and also at least to acknowledge the motivation which has brought them to engage in that action. And then what do we do? How do we put the freedom from want and deprivation into practice? Clearly, some of the most pressing problems can only be addressed on the basis of governmental action. I will not provide a vaccine of one kind or another to any person around me, though I'd very much like to. I simply do not have the means at my disposal. But there are other things that I can produce for others. We all have particular talents, a word that comes to us, in fact, from a parable of Jesus. And the point of those talents is God wants us to use them. And if we use what means we do have on behalf of others, then we are producing in a way that helps them to develop outside of their want, outside of their deprivation. Each of us has some degree of resources. We can also use those resources wisely to see to it, for example, that those who are most hurt near us during the time of the pandemic benefit most from what we can do economically. It might be a time for us to ask, where do I buy? Why am I buying that? To what extent am I relying on transport, which is only causing other things not to be shipped as quickly as they might? By engaging as consumers mindfully, we can also help to reduce the worst effects of deprivation. And then lastly, addressing the sources of fear, the fourth freedom in practice. Sometimes the sources of fear that a person might confront are all too real. And at times, we also, during a period of crisis, need to be willing, able to refer to those near to us and to see what their fears are even before they express them, to help them to cope with an extremely difficult time. The issue of anxiety is sometimes one that can be addressed simply by sharing it, simply by talking it through, by making information available to one another. I can give a very small example of this. I was startled and very pleased at the time that vaccines began to become available. I say began. And members of the faculty at Bard College began emailing to one another where it might be possible to sign up in order to be inoculated against COVID-19. In doing so, of course, they're telling many, many other people who will then be competing for those same places, but they did it anyway. And it turned out that the colleague who told me about a site to which I successfully got the first jab was unable to sign up at that same site. And when I thanked her and said that I thought it was unfair that she had wound up excluded, she simply wrote back to me, "It's fine, we're all in this together. We're all in this together, and together, shouldering the fear, we overcome it. We can do this. We have the capacities within ourselves to offer liberation to others, not simply on the basis of how we define ourselves politically, though that's part of what we do, but on the basis, more importantly, of the way in which we interact with one another. That is the place where liberation can happen, and which makes us see that liberation theology is not simply a movement in theology that once happened, but rather a continuing principle that can offer us growth. Well, I thank you very much for joining us during these presentations. We are thinking of another series coming up. It looks to me as if it will also be a virtual series, but the time, I think, now is not too far off when we'll also be able to meet in person, and to that, I very much look forward. Thank you very much.